Hello, and welcome to session 1 of 6 in MedHealth's Improving Implementation Learning Module series. This session is titled The Key Components of Implementing a BSP. My name's Leonie Harding, and I'll be presenting this material today. Our rationale for our work today is that planned, considered implementation of a comprehensive behaviour support plan is both integral to the plan's success and required as a central role of positive behaviour support. Implementation has historically been inconsistently approached in PBS, and our objective is that learners will understand the integral components of implementation as determined by the guiding NDIS documentation for PBS and as conceptualised best practice. And you can see the links within the NDIS capability framework in core and proficient implementation sections. So first, let's explore why implementation of a comprehensive behaviour support plan is so important. First of all, we know that many plans are underutilised, which is to say that plans will expire without full use of the allocated funds. And this is not necessarily an issue if the funds aren't required, but implementation planning allows us to be sure that the funding available is effectively used to support the person's needs. Implementation planning supports future funding decisions as well. It allows the planner to get a really clear understanding from the practitioner of what the needs are of the person based on functional assessment and how funding can be adjusted, particularly in those cases where we have very, very small plans for specialist behaviour support. Thirdly, spending is very transparent and participant-centred when planning is clear. And clinicians who are implementing the plans feel really comfortable in the use of the participants' funds. It allows us to help stakeholders understand their roles within implementation. And we know that stakeholder involvement can be complex and can encounter barriers. Implementation planning that is clear and transparent and communicated to all stakeholders speeds up restrictive practice fade out. Remember that restrictive practice removal and fade out is the core part of our work as behaviour support practitioners. So implementation planning allows us to really identify how that looks in the shortest possible time. So clearly and transparently planning our implementation of a behaviour support plan gives us the opportunity to create proactive and meaningful change for the person, and that's more likely to occur in this circumstance. Implementation's traditionally been very challenging for behaviour support practitioners right across the NDIS-based PBS industry. And I think there's a number of reasons that this has been the case. First of all, behaviour support goals are challenging to prepare. It has been probably less clearly identified how these should look within our framework, and it's difficult for us to understand how we can make them meaningful for the person and connect them between NDIS goals and the quality of life aspirations for the person. The second barrier that clinicians often identify is determining the key steps in implementation. So they ask, what is the key stage of the BSP? What are the key steps we need to go through to achieve this goal? When should these steps occur? How do we determine as clinicians when these parts of the environmental change have to take place? The third challenge is assigning our values to the work we intend to do. We know that we are working in an industry where there's an enormous amount of divergence and differentiation between participant presentations, and we know that an hour for one participant may not be an hour for another. So clinicians often ask, how long do we give for these tasks? And what if that changes along the way? The fourth question is about assigning responsibility, and many clinicians, particularly those in the early careers phase of PBS, feel that it is complex and confronting to lead supports in a care team and provide direction over their work. It's also very difficult to determine who should own each task in a care team, particularly in care teams that are either very, very small or very, very large. And the fifth barrier or challenge that clinicians often identify is how to create the balance between one-to-one support of the person and holistic training of the supports. And planning and mapping out how much of the implementation phase involves one-to-one skill building for the person and how much involves training supports, indirect supports, stakeholders, who we train, and when this has to occur based on the other deliverables. So hopefully in the next few sessions, we're going to unpack how these particular challenges and barriers can be overcome and answer some of these questions. When we reconsider or reconceptualize implementation and look at it more from a project perspective, the easiest way to create consistency across plans is to use a framework. Frameworks allow us to give a consistent structure to the work that we're doing, regardless of the different presentation of the individual. And we do know that each individual presentation is very, very different in PBS. So there's a number of reasons we use a framework. First of all, a framework gives us an easy to remember set of components. Clinicians, particularly new clinicians, can remember these components very easily when understanding and considering their behaviour support plans. It creates consistency regardless of plan size. Along with the enormous diversity in presentation, we see a great difference in plan size for specialist behaviour support. Some plans can be really quite small and can be very difficult to administer what we need to do within our obligations. Frameworks support a team focus within an organisation, and we know that team-based support, multi-clinician support, and handover-based processes are a significant part of PBS in all PBS businesses, but also in the med health businesses. A framework allows those teams to communicate really effectively and a really clear, instant understanding of where this particular support is up to. Frameworks link planning to implementation. And that is where that tricky spot that we talked about just earlier seems to occur a lot for clinicians. The idea of, I know what I want to do, I just need to make some kind of idea of how I do it. So a framework gives us a step-by-step approach for that. And the last reason we're implementing an implementation framework is that it really improves our clinical defensibility. The concept of being able to communicate to supports what we intend to do with funding and how that looks, and then map our achievements against that plan, discussing barriers and changes along the way, which we know are inevitable. So when we look at a framework, we're looking at consistency in our approach. We're not looking at a one-size-fits-all. And I think it's easy to become concerned that it means that we're going to have a rubber stamping or some kind of template approach to our implementation. No, it always is important to implement every single behaviour support plan independently, just as we write every single behaviour support plan independently. The framework just allows us the consistency in the way we go about that. When we were developing our guidelines for implementation, we had to have a look right back at the beginning of what our role looked like as behaviour support practitioners within the NDIS PBS framework. We know that PBS is worldwide. We know that there are a number of models internationally, and we know that the NDIS has taken a number of different clinical approaches and meshed those together to create what we see as NDIS PBS. So when we looked at our guiding documentation, we looked at three key documents. The NDIS Practitioner Capability Framework, which guides all of our work as practitioners in terms of our capacity. I looked at the NDIS Practice Standards and Quality Indicators, which are really important indicators of how our work should look from an organisational perspective. And then I looked at the policy guidance. So how developing behaviour support plans connects with the concept of implementation. And you can see a number of common themes running across those three guiding documents, particularly in terms of fading out restrictive practices by effectively developing an understanding and supports of what those look like and what the policies, procedures and protocols are for least restrictive, shortest possible use, etc. There was a great emphasis in all of these documents on person-centeredness, choice and control, and participant voice. There was an enormous emphasis on ensuring measurement, data, evidence-based practice, which we know guides all of our work, but ensuring that a behaviour support plan that we write is effective and is measured by measures that we determine. And we looked at the idea of skill building so that in an implementation phase, all people involved in supporting the participant and the participant themselves have an opportunity to develop, grow, and foster positive and proactive behaviour. I think the takeaway from reviewing these three documents is that implementation is central to the role of a behaviour support practitioner, because a behaviour support plan is only as good as its implementation stage. Without such sound implementation, it's just a plan on paper. After we reviewed this particular set of guiding documents, these 5 components have formed the basis for our implementation framework. And I think regardless of the plan size, regardless of the presentation of the participant, these are the most significant steps in developing an implementation plan. 5 components. First of all, restrictive practices fade out. It's important to note that some of our participants don't currently have restrictive practices applied to them. But as we move into a space where we talk about the concept of risk as a departure from behaviour of concern, every person with a disability is at risk of restrictive practices being applied to them, particularly if they are demonstrating behaviours of concern or behaviours of risk. So we need to determine restrictive practice involvement even in plans where they don't exist immediately. The second component deals with environmental modification. The third, with effective data collection and monitoring for that evidence-based practice. The fourth, about training and skill building for the person and the stakeholders. And then about effectively reporting and communicating the work that we're doing. And we're now going to go through each of these in turn. Let's start with looking at what RRP fade out looks like in the implementation framework. And it's important to note that the work that I'm doing in this particular series talks about how these components look in implementation, but there won't be a lot of definition of what these components actually involve themselves. I recommend that all viewers go through the rest of the MedHealth microlearning series and have a look at a range of microlearnings available to discuss things like how to fade out a restrictive practice, what data collection looks like, the concept of identifying and designing implementation. So RRP fade out is basically the idea of planning each task to fade out all or part of an RRP. And we need to remember that restrictive practices may take some time to fade out. It can be a slow process. It can be a staged process. In the BSP, it's important to recognise the links to the RRP protocols, which will determine what fade out looks like. The idea of environmental strategies that mean that the person's environment is changed so the behaviour is no longer necessary. The concept of data collection planning. We need to plan to collect the data so we can prove that this restrictive practice is being faded out and so that we can effectively report that in our subsequent BSPs. Your behaviour support plan should look at skill building so that restrictive practices can be used less, so that they can be less restrictive, short as possible, and so that also the person's pro-social skills develop. And then your risk of harm section should make connections to how the restrictive practice might look or why the restrictive practices come about in the first place. So you may plan a number of tasks, and I've just given some examples here. And the first is about medical reviews. We know that with chemical restraints, PBS practitioners don't have a role in prescribing, but we can initiate, support, and provide information for medical reviews to ensure accuracy and currency of medications prescribed. We might look at implementing trial fade-outs, particularly with concepts like environmental restraints. We can look at trials in low-risk scenarios to support that. We can look at things like increased allied health support. Very common in mechanical restraints. You need allied health support like OTs to ensure that the determination of whether a restraint is therapeutic or whether it is restrictive is very clear. We may need to plan for protocol adjustments as fade-out occurs across time. We may need to plan for team-based evaluation, particularly when we're doing some kind of trial, to evaluate what's happened with the participant, their quality of life and behaviour as a result of that fade-out. So any of these tasks may form part of that implementation step. The second aspect in our framework is about environmental modification. Remembering that environmental modifications are changing the physical, human resource or built surroundings for a person. And we know that changing the environment is a significant way to increase the quality of life for the person, and that most behaviour support plans will require some kinds of modifications to the environment around the person and other stakeholders involved. You'll note here that there are a number of aspects in the BSP and in the FBA that are really important in determining how this looks for implementation. You need to know your proactive strategies and how they're designed. You need to know the response strategies and what they look like. You need to know and be very, very familiar with your formulation from the FBA. So understanding what are the perpetuating factors, what are the precipitating factors, how do we create the low risk scenarios for the person to reduce the likelihood of behaviour and to increase their quality of life. It's also important when you're planning implementation to determine the communication and sensory profile for the person so that you can involve allied health where necessary, but also make the modifications for training for supports to understand those better. And the last thing to bear in mind in your BSP is what the support needs are for the person. And look at what your BSP says and consider when you're writing your BSPs. What is it that we need to adjust about support for the person? And what is my role in terms of the BSP as a practitioner in providing training for those supports so that they understand what we're attempting to do? So in terms of tasks that you might plan out for implementation, you could be looking at home transitions. You could be looking at furnishing or items in the person's home. You could be looking at modifications to the facility in terms of fixed or portable modifications. You could be looking at community access and support. And you could be looking at the support structures around the person in terms of one-to-one supports, activity supports, home and living. The third section of the implementation framework that we need to consider in every behaviour support plan is how we're going to design our data collection and monitoring. And there are micro-learnings that talk about data design methodology. In this context, we're talking about how we design our data collection in the implementation phase, because we need to measure whether our behaviour support plan is actually effective. So the idea here is that we need to find evidence that the strategies are working, that restrictive practices are reducing, and that quality of life is increasing. And this is actually a fairly complicated ask because we're often looking at very qualitative measures. So in terms of your behaviour support plan, be guided by what your risks of harm look like, intensity, frequency. Look at your proactive strategies. What are you putting in place and how can you measure that those have occurred and when you ask them to? Look at your response strategies. Look at the data collection that says from the supports, is the response plan effective in returning the person to baseline? And look at your restrictive practice protocols and how you're going to measure use of things like episodic restraints, how you're going to measure the use of routine restraints. So you may need to plan a range of different data collection methods, including interviews, observations, but also things like data analysis. So time for yourself in the implementation to go through the data collected and evaluate what that looks like. And also then you have to allow time in your implementation plan for reporting to the appropriate bodies at the appropriate time. The next section in every implementation plan should look at training and skill building. And it's important to recognise that we're building skills for the person, but we're also, and very critically, building skills for the supports around the person. In your BSP, you should be looking at your behaviour support goal. What are we aiming to know? You should be looking at your skill building mapping in your behaviour support plan, particularly in the 3.0 template, where skill building takes the place of what we would have seen probably as verbs in the previous templates. Look at what the skills are, who has to learn them, and who has to teach those skills, bearing in mind that only some of them may come from the BSP. You will have also work with allied health, but you'll also have supports embedding skill building for the participant. Again, we lean heavily into our communication and sensory profiles from our FBA and comprehensive to make sure we understand the person effectively. And then we want to look at aspirations. We want to look at what the person is seeking, what is important to them in this 12-month period, and how we can ensure that that is the focus of our work. So you may consider staff training, support training, family training, which is really important in family-based scenarios, one-to-one person skill building, and implementation of restrictive practices, ensuring that supports are delivering those effectively. The final component in our framework is reporting. And we know that we have a number of obligations about our reporting that we have to commit to and that are very time bound. But we also have an obligation to report accurately the work that we are doing and the way that we are administering our participant funds. So, some key considerations within the reporting structure are the roles of your stakeholders. Who is going to provide information to us, and to whom do we provide information? We need to allow time in our implementation plan for updating the FBA and the comprehensive. Importantly, we must remember that updating the FBA begins on the day that the behaviour support plan becomes in place. So it's not necessarily just allocating a great portion of time just before the plan is due. We need to think about progress reports that we may need to provide, both formally for planning and plan reviews, and less formally to various stakeholders. We need to think about data reporting. How are we collecting data? How are we reporting the data? And then we need to think about establishing care team meetings and support and stakeholder meetings so that we've got the right people understanding the right information at the right time. And that's part of that reporting requirement. So in terms of planning out the tasks and implementation, we may need to think about care team meetings and support meetings, and they may involve a range of different people. We need to think about working together an implementation plan and project plan and support plan documentation, all of those documents that help communicate what our plan is moving forward. We need to think about outcomes and progress reports as formally determined by our organisations. We need to make sure that we're planning in the FBA and the CBS peer reviews, as I said before, not just in a big chunk at the end, but along the process so that we know that we're collecting meaningful data. And then we also have to plan for things like letters of recommendation and other communication that may come about as part of the work that we're doing with the person. So our aim is on clear communication of our progress and outcome, and we have to plan for that to ensure that we have adequate funding to do so. So what happens next? First of all clinicians should really think about the tasks in each component. What do those tasks look like for me? Brainstorm those tasks and give some feedback to your team, to your supports. Those tasks often cross over, but they can be interpreted differently for different clinicians. It's important to think about your own learning needs. What do you need to understand in order to be able to plan out implementation for your participants? Starting tomorrow, begin to review your portfolio. Begin to consider subtasks in each component and how they can map out. And consider the support you need to create implementation. Coming up, there are 7 parts in the implementation learning module. This is step 1, and these will be available as part of this series. There is always team lead and leadership and clinical support available to all clinicians. And there are going to be a range of resources and guidance, not the least of which the previously existing micro-learnings in this series, but also lean into your own clinical frameworks and supports to get additional guidance on implementation. Thank you for being part of this session.